All right, good morning again.
Good morning.
All right, we're about to begin, or we're starting, I should say. Um, is there any questions from the previous lecture or session? Yes, no?
No.
Okay. All right, so the previous class we covered the respiratory system and we started to look at the circulatory system, right? And the function of the circulatory system is to circulate blood, which contains oxygen and nutrients, right? And remove carbon dioxide and waste so that the cells in the body can get proper resources for metabolism, the process of metabolism, right? Which is how the cells create energy. And I mentioned in the previous class that in order for that to be efficient, we must have oxygen with the required amount of oxygen. We must have glucose, nutrients, waste must be removed, right? So once oxygen is involved, it's aerobic metabolism. If there's no oxygen involved, it's anaerobic, and less energy is produced. We looked at the composition of the blood, right? And I stated that the blood is composed of white blood cells, which are your leukocytes, red blood cells, erythrocytes, platelets, and plasma. The role of the white blood cells is to fight infection, right, within the body. The red blood cells is responsible for the transportation of oxygen, so it's important to the process of oxygenation. Platelets are important to clotting, and the plasma is the fluid portion of the blood. We also discuss the vessels, the blood vessels, which are the pipes, right? We looked at the arteries, the largest artery in the body, which is the aorta, smallest arterioles. We look at the direction of flow. So arteries carry blood away from the heart primarily, and that blood is usually oxygenated, except for the pulmonary arteries, which transport deoxygenated blood from the heart, right side, to the lungs. And I mentioned to you that the arteries transport high pressure blood, right? So the blood that is flowing within the arteries is under high pressure. We looked at the veins, largest vein, vena cava, smallest veins, venules. Veins primarily carry blood towards the heart. That blood is under low pressure. All veins carry deoxygenated blood with the exception of the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left side of the heart. All right, so let us go forward now. Zoom. Let me zoom in. All right, so now we are going to look directly at the heart. So we have looked at the composition of the blood vessels. Let's look at the heart. The heart is a muscle, and the purpose of the heart is to receive blood and distribute blood. That's the purpose. Receive and distribute blood. So it's a muscle. The size of your heart is the size of your fist, right? So the size of your heart is the size of your fist. it has 4 chambers. The 2 upper chambers of the heart are responsible for receiving blood, and the lower chambers of the heart are responsible for distributing or pumping the blood out. The heart has a right side and a left side, and there is a wall that separates the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart. The right side is primarily, the right side function is to transport deoxygenated blood. The left side function is to transport oxygenated blood. Just like the lungs, the heart has a membrane that surrounds it, and that membrane has a inner and outer lining. So there's an inner and outer lining, and the inner lining is directly attached to the heart, right? So there's a lining that is directly attached to the heart. That is the visceral pericardium. Sorry, the visceral. Why is it slipping me at this point? I will get back to that. For some reason, my brain just went blank. Oh, you have the visceral pericardial sac, and you have the parietal pericardial sac. So the parietal portion is the outer portion. The visceral portion would be the portion that is directly attached to the heart muscle, right? And just like the lungs, the purpose of that membrane is to prevent friction when the heart muscle moves. Now, within the heart and outside of the heart, you have valves. The purpose of the valves is to prevent backflow. So the valves are there to prevent the backflow of blood. When these valves open and close, this is what we're listening to when we listen to the heartbeat. So we're listening to the valves open and close. That is the heart muscle in terms of structure that you would need to be familiar with. Now, the wall that separates the right side of the heart from the left side is referred to as the septum of the heart. Any questions at this time? No questions?
No.
Anybody else? Okay. All right. Let us continue. Now, the upper chambers of the heart are referred to as the atriums. I have a right atrium and a left atrium. The lower chambers of the heart are referred to as the ventricles. You have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. The left ventricle is the largest chamber of the heart, and the reason for that is it is the chamber of the heart that does the most work. Now, because it is the chamber of the heart that does the most work, it means that that is the chamber of the heart that is prone to complications. For instance, an MI. So MIs would be common on the left, in the left ventricle, right? So that's the chambers. So we have looked at the composition of the blood. We have looked at the blood vessels. We have looked at the heart muscle itself. So let's recap. The heart is a muscle, right? The size of the heart is the size of your fist. It's going to be bigger in males than it is in females. The purpose of the heart muscle is to receive and distribute blood. The upper chambers of the heart is responsible for receiving blood. The lower chambers of the heart is responsible for distributing that blood. The heart is divided into a right side and a left side. The right side transports deoxygenated blood. The left side transports oxygenated blood. There are valves within the heart and outside of the heart. And the purpose of these valves is to prevent backflow of blood. When these valves open and close, this is what we are listening to when we listen to the heartbeat. The heart has a protective membrane with an inner portion and an outer portion. So you have the visceral pericardial membrane, and you have the parietal pericardial membrane. Visceral would be the portion that is directly attached to the heart, and parietal would be directly attached to the cavity space, or it's the outer portion. Now let's look at how blood flows. So we need to now understand the movement of blood through the circulatory system. So this is where I need you to pay close attention. So you need to, and if it is not clear after, let me know that. So we are starting on the right side of the heart, right? So you have the superior and inferior vena cava, right? The superior vena cava receives blood from the upper portion of the body. The inferior vena cava receives blood from the lower portion of the body. This is deoxygenated blood, meaning it is not carrying oxygen, right? It is not oxygenated. This deoxygenated blood is then collected into the right atrium, which is right here. The right atrium then contracts and pumps that blood through this valve right here into the right ventricle. And I remember that valve by saying try right. Try right. So the tricuspid valve is on the right side. Right? So try right. That's how I remember it. Tricuspid valve on the right side. The right ventricle receives the deoxygenated blood. The right ventricle then contracts and pumps that blood into the pulmonary artery or arteries. Before it enters the pulmonary arteries, it has to pass through a valve. That valve is referred to as the pulmonic valve. The pulmonary artery then divides into a right and left portion. That deoxygenated blood is going to travel through the pulmonary arteries, which will eventually break down. Listen to me carefully now. The pulmonary arteries will eventually break down or get smaller. They become pulmonary arterioles. When they break down to pulmonary arterioles, they will eventually break down to form pulmonary capillaries, right? they will eventually attach to the pulmonary capillaries. I have the pulmonary capillaries form a net. So they form a net over the alveoli or ear sac. Now, at the point that the deoxygenated blood cells are passing through the pulmonary capillaries, which are hugging the alveoli or ear sac, at that point, oxygen comes down into the ear sac at the same time. It must occur at the same time. There is a higher concentration of oxygen in the ear sac and a low concentration of oxygen in the capillaries, and we get diffusion at that point. So oxygen diffuses into the blood that is flowing in the capillaries. CO2 leaves and enters the ear sac and is exhaled from the lungs. So the blood is now oxygenated. The blood now has oxygen. So the oxygenated side of the pulmonary capillaries then connects to the pulmonary venules, which are the smallest veins in the body. The pulmonary venules then forms the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins now transport the oxygenated blood. So the blood is now oxygenated. It now transport that oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The left atrium then contracts and pushes that blood through a valve on the left side. Miss Harris, do you have a question?
No, sir.
Okay. Mute your mic. All right. Right. So the left atrium contracts, pushes the blood through the valve on the left side. And I remember that valve by saying my or by left. So try right, tricuspid valve, right side. My or by left. Mitral or bicuspid valve is on the left side, right? The blood is then pumped into the left ventricle, which is the largest chamber of the heart because it does the most work. The left ventricle then contracts and pumps that blood into the aorta. When it enters the aorta, there's a valve inside the aorta that the blood will pass through, and then that valve closes. That's the aortic valve. The aorta then divides into what we call the ascending aorta and descending aorta. The ascending aorta goes to the upper portion of the body. The descending aorta goes to the lower portion of the body. Now the aorta will eventually break down into arteries within the various systems within the body. These arteries will eventually break down to systemic capillaries. And then these systemic, what am I saying? The pulmonary, the aorta will eventually break down into the systemic arteries. These systemic arteries will eventually break down into systemic arterioles. The systemic arterioles are connected Two, systemic capillaries, which are over the cells within the body. At that point, the blood within the systemic capillaries is oxygenated, and the cells have less oxygen, more CO2. And then we get the process of diffusion occurring again at a cellular level, where oxygen enters the cell and CO2 enters the systemic capillaries. So the cells are now oxygenated, and they are able to carry out their normal metabolic function. But the blood that is now in the systemic capillary is now once again deoxygenated. The systemic capillaries will eventually form systemic venules. The systemic venules will eventually form systemic veins. And the blood that these veins are carrying is now deoxygenated. The veins will eventually form the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, and the process of circulating the blood begins again. So it's a connected network. I know that's a lot of information, right? Any questions? Because I have a question for you. So ask your question and then I will ask mine. Any questions? Yes, no? Miss Nesbeth, any question?
No, sir.
Miss Jackson, any questions? Miss Jackson? Miss Jackson? Okay. Mr. Jennings, any questions?
No, sir.
Miss Johnson?
No, sir.
All right. You have no question, no questions. I just said a whole lot, right? Miss Harris, you have any questions? Oh, she's having connection issues. So
No,
this is
sir.
my question. This is my question. So let's see if you understand anything that I just went through. Listen carefully to the question. It is a circulation question. So listen very carefully. The right ventricle is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood and pumping that deoxygenated blood via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. However, there is damage. So this patient has a damaged right ventricle. It is no longer able to carry out that function effectively. Where are we going to have a problem right away? So let me repeat the question again, right? The right ventricle is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood, and pumping that deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs for it to be oxygenated. However, this patient has a myocardial infarction, a heart attack on the right side, the right ventricle. So it's damaged. It can no longer carry out that function effectively. What is going to happen? Or what are you expecting to happen? Miss Nesbeth, go ahead.
Sir, I didn't have up my hand, but I'll try.
I know I'm not gonna ask you to put up your hand for this one.
Okay, well, the pulmonary
Everybody has, go ahead.
the pulmonary circulation will be compromised because no blood will be capable of leaving the heart, or too little blood will be capable of leaving to the heart to go into the pulmonary arteries. So you won't have oxygenation taking place. So in turn, the tissues won't be perfused with blood, because it will affect the amount of oxygen available to the cells.
Okay, okay. Remember, I say it is a circulation question, right? Miss Harris. Go ahead, Miss Harris. Okay. Mr. Jennings.
Good morning again, sir.
Morning.
So if there's failure of
There's,
the right ventricle,
didn't say failure. I said it's damaged.
it's damaged.
Yeah. Didn't say it has failed. There could be.
It
But
could be.
not completely failed yet.
Okay. Either way, you're saying that there is an issue with the pumping. So if it's a case where the ventricle is not contracting enough to push out that blood to the pulmonary artery, then you might have some residual blood left inside. And if you have residual blood left inside, then the right atrium might not be able to push out as much blood into it to fill it back up, because you have that residual blood. So there might be a backflow of blood. If you have a backflow of blood, then that backflow then translates into the rest of the body from the vena cava, and then when you have that, then that might result in like swelling throughout the body. Well, I don't remember what she was saying about oxygenation. What I think might happen is that because you don't have that efficient transport throughout, that person might have some hypoxia going on through their body, mostly because that the blood that's flowing through the pulmonary artery is so slow that it then goes throughout the oxygenated section. And when that happens, the oxygenation process takes much slower, so the tissues won't be able to get oxygen as fast. So that person might have some amount of breathing difficulty due to that, the body trying to get that but it can't. I think that's called a positive feedback loop. So where the carbon dioxide is built up in the body and it just wants to get it out, so it tries to pump it much faster. What else might happen?
All right. See, I can see your thought process. Miss Jackson, go ahead. Miss Jackson, it would appear she's still having connection problems. Miss Johnson, go ahead.
So, if the right ventricle is not working, then it means that the circulation would not be taking place, basically.
Okay. Be a little more specific. When you say that circulation will not be taking place, be a little more specific.
All right, I'm thinking of it since it's the piping system. It's
Yeah.
like a pipe. So if there
Mm-hmm.
is any obstruction in one section of the pipe, then
Mm-hmm.
of course, for example, if it's a hose and the hose is kinked, which means that water starts settling in one direction, then it could weaken the valve, and of course, something could burst.
Okay. All right. I see it. I see your thought process. Miss Harris. Miss Harris. All right. Still having connection problems. All right. So the responses I've heard so far, I can hear the critical. I can see the critical thinking process going on. Right. So it's, as I said, it's a circulation question. And yes, the pulmonary circulation would be compromised. You would definitely have a back pressure, right? And what is going to happen or occur right off the bat is if the right ventricle is damaged, it can no longer effectively receive blood and distribute that blood. So it means that not all of the blood is being pumped out of the right ventricle. So if the right ventricle is not emptying, it means that blood would be coming from the right atrium and pooling in the right ventricle, and that is going to compromise the valve. I think somebody said that. That is going to compromise the valve, and then you get a back pressure starting to build up in the right atrium, and that back pressure will eventually build up into the veins or vena cava. And that's a patient that you're going to start to see the neck veins popping up in the neck. You're going to start to see something that is called distended neck veins, right? When the patient is sitting at a 45-degree angle. The back pressure would also be transferred to the lower portion of the body. So the veins that supplying the liver will become distended, right? And there's a test that can be done for these patients that when you put pressure on the liver, it actually causes the veins in the neck to pop up. There will be pressure building up in the lower extremities, and that pressure is going to start to push the plasma out of its normal space, and they start to get fluid accumulating in the legs, right? This is a patient that is about to go into failure. So they are starting to go into what would be considered right side heart failure. So the whole point of the question is to determine if you understand anatomy and physiology, you must be able to reverse the process. So when you're learning anatomy and physiology, if you cannot reverse the process, right? So if you don't know what is going to happen when that structure is not functioning effectively, then you won't be able to manage the patient, because when you have a patient in front of you, you are going to see the signs and symptoms. The patient is not going to tell you that something is wrong with my circulatory system, right? So you need to know what to look for if the circulatory system is not circulating the blood effectively. So that's the point of the question. Now, the other part to that question, which is going to be easy because we understand the concept now. So the concept is, if the ventricles cannot pump enough blood out, back pressure will be created where the blood is coming from. I'm going to repeat that again. If the ventricles are not able to pump the blood out adequately, back pressure will be created where the blood is coming from. All right. So this patient now has a heart attack on the left side. So it's a left ventricle that is damaged. The function of the left ventricle is to receive oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins via the lungs and pump that blood into the aorta and circulate it within the rest of the body. But the patient has a damaged left ventricle. So they have a MI, a heart attack, left ventricle. Where would the back pressure end up for this patient? So where is the back pressure going to end up for this patient? Miss Jackson, I haven't heard you from morning. Are you with me at this point? Miss Jackson? If you're able to hear me, type your response in the chat. Miss Harris, are you with me at this point? If you were able to hear the question, Miss Harris, type your response in the chat. Miss Nesbeth, back to you again. Go ahead.
All right, so there will be a backflow into the pulmonary veins, which would essentially result in the same, I don't know if I have the right term, could it be pulmonary edema?
Okay.
Right, where basically because of that pressure, then water would be flooding the lungs and would essentially just prevent it from contracting and respond. But it's really pulmonary, the pulmonary system, meaning the pulmonary artery would be having the pulmonary veins would be having a problem.
Okay. Mr. Jennings, keep it short.
Yes, sir. If you have a damage, then yes, I agree with what Ms. Nesbitt said. The backflow would be into the lungs, causing the pulmonary edema. There's also some other complications that might happen, but you say to keep it short, so.
Right. Ms. Johnson, go ahead.
I agree with what was said before, but I am wondering, my grandmother had a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Would that be as a result of something wrong with her left ventricle, and then it was then pushing the blood towards the aorta, and eventually whatever happened? I don't know. I'm asking.
That is something that we will cover down the line, but the little I will say about that is when a patient has a aortic aneurysm, aneurysm is a weak area in the wall of the aorta. So there's a weak point, right? Think of it as a, you ever hear them talk about a baby panataya? Yes, Miss Johnson?
Baby panat? No, I don't think so.
You never hear that saying yet in Jamaica, say you tired of a baby.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. So think of it as that. There's a weak point in the wall of the aorta. And one of the common things that cause that is uncontrolled high blood pressure, right?
Okay.
So what is going to happen is over time, that pressure, because the area is so weak, it can either split the wall, can either divide the wall, or it can completely rupture that weak point. You understand?
Yes. Thank
Right.
you.
Good. All right. Good. You guys are sharp. I like it. I like it. So you are correct. The back pressure would end up in the lungs. If the left ventricle is damaged or the left ventricle has a MI, it is no longer able to pump that oxygenated blood that it is receiving to the rest of the body effectively. So it is not completely emptying. So you get pooling of blood in the left ventricle. Then you get a back pressure of that into the into the left atrium. The valve is compromised. Then you start to get back pressure into the pulmonary vessels, the pulmonary veins. And think of it as blood is moving this way and blood is moving that way. So there's a pressure being created. And when the blood meet, it starts to push plasma out. So the plasma starts to be pushed out, and that accumulates in the ear sacs, and we get what is called pulmonary edema, which if they are coming to you, Miss Nesbitt, we get pulmonary edema. And if there is fluid in the ear sac, it will interfere with the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this patient is going to have serious trouble breathing. They're going to have a breathing issue. Yes, Miss Nesbitt, go ahead.
I know that you're concentrating on what happens, like whenever there is an accumulation, the backflow, the back pressure, but it also has consequences for the.
I know.
Okay.
I will get there. Remember what I've said previously. We will creep before we walk, and then we will run. It's not that time yet. So just work with me. We'll get there, right? So there is going to be back pressure in the lungs. It can affect the patient's ability to breathe. No, that is an indication of left side heart failure. So a patient can present with right side heart failure. A patient can present with left side heart failure. Now, if the right side is failing, if the right side of the heart is failing and it is not corrected, eventually the left side of the heart will be compromised, right? It is a circulatory problem. So if the circulation is compromised, it means we will ultimately have an issue with perfusion throughout the body, right? And it's the same on the left side. So if the left side is failing and it is not corrected, it will eventually affect the right side, right? And it's a circulation and significant breathing issue now, right? So it will compromise the perfusion as well. Once perfusion is compromised, it will lead to what we call hypoperfusion, that's shock, right? And shock in layman terms is failure of the cardiovascular system. Now, when it is both sides that are failing, it is referred to as congestive heart failure. Now, my next question to you is, if it is the right side if the patient has right side failure or left side failure, which patient would decline faster and why? So if the patient has right side heart failure, or well, this would be my right side heart failure or left side heart failure, which patient will decline faster? Who want to take that question? Raise your hand. Yes, Miss Nesbitt, go ahead.
I'm just trying. So I would say if the patient has left side heart failure, why? Is
Yes.
because the lungs will be compromised, and once the lungs are compromised, then that leads to a faster decline than if you have, like, for example, edema or distension in the neck or swelling in the feet. But the lungs, once they fill up with water, then the decline is going to be more rapid, because that is when the patient will go into hypoxia or multiple system hypoxia called shock.
Okay, I hear you. Mr. Jennings, go ahead.
Boy. Yes, is definitely the left side.
Okay,
For my
give your
rationale,
rationale. Yes.
I'd say with that compromise in the delivery of oxygenated blood, a lot of tissue damage is going to occur, and that tissue damage might occur in very important regions of the body. And like she said, with that difficulty in breathing, that patient might start to use accessory muscles, and all kinds of complications can occur. Yeah, it's definitely the left side. It's definitely the left side.
All right, I hear you. Miss Johnson, let me hear your thoughts.
I'm thinking the same thing, what everybody else
Yes,
is thinking. That
give
it is
your
that
rationale.
if
Give
it
your rationale.
so if the left ventricle is compromised, and as before, we spoke about it, the backflow going into the pulmonary veins and into the lungs, and then the capillaries, and a lot of things will get compromised. And of course, the lungs will also become compromised, which is very important for breathing. So
Yep,
then the left ventricle, definitely.
the left side. All right, cool. So we're on the same page. Good. Right? So as you go through your various systems within the body, these are questions that you need to ask yourself, right? So once you finish a system and you look at the function, start to think about what would happen if that system is not able to carry out its function, and what would I see if that patient is in front of me? How would I know it's that system, right? So I want you to start thinking that way. All right, good. Miss Jackson, you are with us? Miss Jackson used about 4 different phones. She still can't come in yet. Anyway, it's being recorded. Let me zoom out. All right, good. So that's the structures of the circulatory system. That's the movement of the blood. There's another component to it, which I call the electrical conduction. I also cause you, and I have a system for teaching that. I call it the Dudder's principle. I'm not ready to teach you the Dudder's principle as yet, but certainly down the line, we are going to cover that. Not going to go too much into the electrical conduction at this point. We're just focusing on the structure and function. All right, so moving forward. All right, I still need to zoom out a little bit more. All right, let's go forward. So the heart. The heart is a hollow muscular organ that is approximately the size of an adult's clenched fist. Made of specialized cardiac muscle, works as two paired pumps, and you have the septum, is a wall that divides the right and left sides. Each side is divided into atrium and a ventricle. So the upper portion or upper chambers are the atriums, the lower chambers are the ventricles. The heart receives blood from the aorta. So I mentioned to you previously that arteries primarily carry blood away from the heart. However, there is an exception, right? So when the blood enters the, let me backtrack a bit. Enlarge this. So this is the aorta. When the blood enters the aorta, the aortic valve closes. But there is a artery that originates from this area. It's called the coronary artery, right? And the coronary artery is the artery that supplies the heart muscle itself with blood. Now, how that occurs is when the blood passes through the aortic valve, it closes and there is backflow. So there's a backflow of blood, and that backflow fills the coronary arteries. So what that means is the coronary arteries do not fill under high pressure, right? So these are arteries that do not fill under high pressure. And these are the arteries that will be affected when a patient has a heart attack, coronary arteries. All right, so let's zoom out. All right. The right side receives deoxygenated blood from the vein. So I always said the right side is the dirty side and the left side is the clean side, right? The left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. All right, now the normal resting heart rate for an adult is 60 to 100 beats per minute. The younger the patient, the faster the heart will beat, right? Now that is influenced via stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood moved by one beat, and stroke volume is influenced by the amount of blood that is pooling into the ventricle, how far the ventricle can stretch, and how great that contraction will be, and of course how fast the heart is beating. Now, cardiac output. This is the amount of blood moved throughout the heart in 1 minute. And the cardiac output is influenced by heart rate and stroke volume. Heart rate, so how fast the heart is beating, amount of blood that is entering the ventricles. The greater the ventricle can stretch, the slower the contraction. Very important point for you to keep in mind. So athletes that are well developed, that do a lot of aerobic type workouts, their heart muscle is more developed than your heart muscles, because I am in good shape. My heart is well developed. So what that means is they have a greater stretch. If they have a greater stretch, more blood can enter the ventricle and you get a greater contraction, but it's going to be slower, right? And that would be considered normal for that person because they are athletic. Now, if the heart has less room to stretch, you will get a weaker contraction. If the contraction is weak, the heart rate will increase. So I'll get a faster heart rate, but the contraction is weaker, right? All right, so the electrical conduction system, and we're just skimming the surface of it right now. We will go more into it when we cover cardiovascular emergencies. So in order for the heart to have a rhythmic contraction, it comes from electrical stimulation and the movement of electrolytes, negative and positive electrolytes, but we're not going to go into that right now. Right, so electrical conduction system causes smooth, coordinated contractions. Contractions produce pumping action. That's all we need to know for now. The arteries. Arteries carry blood from the heart to all body tissues. The aorta branches into the coronary arteries, which supplies the heart muscle directly with blood. The carotid arteries, which would supply the head with blood, the brain and the head with blood. The hepatic arteries would supply the liver, renal arteries, the kidneys, mesenteric would be the intestines. Oh man, what just happened? Are you still able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think I might be having some connection issues on this end. All right, take a 10-minute break. It's, what time is it? We will start back at 3 minutes past 10. So take a 10-minute break. Need to figure out what's going on with this connection problem. All right, I will be logging out and re-entering, but take a break during that time.